Thank you, everybody. Indeed, I'm going to be talking about Limitarianism and capitalism. And in case you know some of my work, you know what Limitarianism is. If not, don't worry, I will explain it later. Whether we know what capitalism is actually, we all think we know it, but actually we will see at the end whether we know what capitalism is. But I first want to start by giving you a few examples of things that are basically setting the scene of the background against which I will be making my arguments. Here is, as you all know, Elon Musk. Last week, Elon Musk became the first person whose estimated wealth surpassed $500 billion. Now, I don't know who of you is used in your daily life to work with trillions. I'm not. So I always have to think, okay, $500 billion, that's 500 billion, so that's $500,000 million. Still, for most of us, $500,000 million, it's difficult to know what this means. So I always use as a kind of a mental trick or a cognitive trick, think about a house that's worth $1 million. I mean, we can imagine something. So 500,000 of those really nice houses. He's now at $500 billion. The estimate is that we will have trillionaires in a couple of years. When I started to give talks on this book that I've written, the first version in Dutch came out in, well, actually, just about 2 years ago. He had, off the top of my head, something like 215 billion. And now he has already $500 billion, so you can just see the curve, how it's going up. So I think Musk, the case of Musk really raises the question, where will it end? At least for me, that's one of the questions that it raises. Here's a second example. This morning, we learned that Zohran Mamdani has been elected to be the next, well, the new mayor of New York City. But what intrigued me when I was reading up on all the news on his candidacy was that there was increasingly resistance from very wealthy, not just New Yorkers, but also billionaires outside New York against his candidacy. So I tried to trace down some of the facts, and I found an article in Forbes magazine where they searched for all the donations that were more than $50,000 to campaigns that argued against him. So not directly to his opponents, but to groups that were basically arguing against his candidacy. And in total, the billionaires have donated over 22 million to back opposition campaigns with anti-Mamdani messages. For example, the biggest donation was from Bloomberg, who gave more than 8 million. And this is something that I found in my research, on which I'll talk a bit more later on, that that donations, really large donations against certain opponents, is one of the things we see in this area of wealth concentration. Now, Mamdani has been running on a ticket which contained what people call socialist policies, rent freezes, making childcare and city buses free. I should say rent control. We've had that in my country as long as I can remember. Free childcare is a topic that every election comes up in my country. We don't have free city buses. I also don't know whether that's actually good policy, because the economist in me would say, if you make the price zero, there's always some serious demand issues. And he would propose to pay for this by increasing the top marginal income tax rate in New York City by 2 percentage points, and by increasing the corporate income tax from 7.25%, which is the current rate, to the rate of New Jersey, which is just across the river, which is 11.5%. And apparently this set of policies was enough to generate this strong opposition against his plans. And I think what is interesting is not just this particular case, but also now that we know that he won, it is when I speak with my colleagues who are political scientists in the US, we talk about the flaws of the political system, they keep saying that the influence of large donations is really a feature of the American system, and they speak of that one needs what they call a war chest before one can stand for election. Mamdani created, just like the other Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, created the revenues by many, many small donations, but that is still a model that is less likely to succeed. So this was the second thing that happened over the last week. And now the third, a completely different thing. In Paris, there is a group of economists. The most famous one is Thomas Piketty, who in 2014 wrote his book, Capitalism in the 21st Century. By now they have a group of older, younger, but a very strong group of economists. And their aim is to share data on inequality and all sorts of aspects of inequality to empower citizens to make up their own minds. And last week they came out with the 2025 Climate Inequality report. And some of the headlines of that report is, well, first of all, they start by noting that the emissions budget to stay under 1.5 degrees warming is more or less exhausted. And against this background, they say that the findings that they earlier reported on, that the 1% richest people in the world have many more emissions than other groups, namely the 1% emit 15% of total emissions, that is actually not even the main problem. The main problem is that their investments actually are equivalent to 41% of all global emissions. So the findings of this report, or the analysis, suggest that if climate action policies, which are very badly needed, are rolled out in a way that delegates or makes all these policies being provided by the private sector, then what we will see is that the share of wealth that the 1% globally has, which currently is 38%, that they predict that this will increase to 46%. So they are really saying, like, climate policies, climate action, and wealth inequality cannot be discussed separately, and we have to really think carefully about who will be in charge of climate policies. So these three examples, what kind of questions do they raise? To me, the Musk example, apart from all other types of questions to do with his tweets and all the things he airs in the public sphere, is really the question, can we at some point say that one has too much? And that was one of the questions that started me thinking about this topic about now 13 years ago. But this then led to another question, which is, why would one think that one can never have enough? Because we've all been raised in this area where since 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, there's only been one game in town, which is capitalism, although we will see that there are different forms. And one of the core aspects of capitalism is that wealth actually is a good thing. It's an indicator of success. It's something positive. But I think increasingly there are reasons to believe that wealth also comes with harms. And hence we have to really think about the balance between the harms of excessive wealth concentration with the positive effects, namely that wealth can be created because people innovate and create welfare for all. And so that was what got me thinking about this question about the ethics of wealth inequality and wealth concentration. I wrote a number of academic papers on this, which you can find. They're all open access, but they may not be readable. There's all very technical and boring stuff. But there is this book, which I think anybody can read, which made the case for what I've come to call Limitarianism. So Limitarianism is the view that there should be, morally speaking, an upper limit to how much personal wealth each person can have. It is a moral view, and all the reasons I give are moral reasons, but that doesn't mean it has no implications for society. The difference, however, is that both where we would put that line might be different, the reasoning is different, but also that when it concerns how we organize society, it should be seen as what also Kant, who also came up with the crooked timber phrase, called a regulative ideal. That means it is an ideal for which we have good reasons to want to try to get closer to that ideal, even though it may be that we will never be able to reach it. So, but we actually have a lot of those ideals in society. If you think about human rights, which are generally, well, I mean, they're actually under pressure now with authoritarian and extreme right parties, but human rights, to the extent that they are widely shared as moral norms, they are also not always exactly protected, but that doesn't mean that they are any less important. And I think the same can be said about something as, if we want to limit inequality, wealth inequality, and we want at the same time that nobody is poor, then it's almost like a mathematical property, because this is inequality, that you have to do something about how far the top can go. Now, what do we think about this idea that there should be a limit to wealth? George Monbiot, one of this country's most influential commentators, wrote a piece in 2019 where he said that Limitarianism was an idea that he thought was necessary to save the planet, but he said it was also one of the most blasphemous ideas in contemporary discourse. My experience talking about this for the last 2 years is that I found that there are different kinds of reactions. I come across readers who say, yeah, sure. I mean, this is obvious, isn't it? Thank you for laying out the arguments. I also come across readers who say, oh, when I first heard about this, I really thought this was too extreme, but they were willing, with an open mind, to go through the book, read it and engage with the reasons. And then they said, there was actually a businessman in London who told me that I made him change his mind about the arguments, that in the beginning he thought, no, this is too extreme. And one of his arguments was actually that he wasn't sure whether it was possible to have this view and at the same time not to reject capitalism, to which I will come back later. So this is clearly something on people's mind, that they are also worried that if they would endorse Limitarianism, that means they have to reject capitalism. And this is, I think, an important point of discussion, which I hope to clarify in the next 45 minutes. What the book does is to lay out the reasons. Reason is the core concept for a philosopher. The reasons is why we think something, which in this case is a norm, should be the case. We as human beings, we exchange reasons all the time. Sometimes they are a bit superfluous, sometimes they're really worked out. We have to balance different reasons when we come to an overall judgment. That also means that I am offering these reasons to the citizens, and it's for the citizens to make up their mind. I don't have like access to some kind of eternal truth, but I want to give the reasons, share them with you, and then basically feed those arguments into the public domain. Now, what are those reasons? Here are some of the reasons. I say some because there are other scholars working on Limitarianism, and they are actually developing more reasons. But I will give you some of the reasons, and I will have to warn you that I will have to be a bit brief, because each of those reasons is actually a chapter in the book. The first reason is that many of the big fortunes are tainted. And when we think about tainted money, we typically, in Europe, start to think about money, for example, that was tainted by the Nazis, or about transatlantic slavery. But as I argue in that chapter, these are the clear cases where I am assuming everybody agrees, but actually it's really different shades of gray. And at the end, you have cases such as tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal, tax avoidance is legal. But one of the things that I found out in my research is that, for example, the line between tax avoidance and tax evasion has shifted over time so that many practices that in the past were illegal have now become legal. How is that possible? Because there is a thing which scholars call the wealth defense industry that is in the process of lobbying to change the laws so that certain practices become legal. So that means that actually many people may be sitting on money where they should really ask themselves, actually, is it okay that I have this money? And we have examples, also some beautiful examples in the UK, including Glasgow University, where, for example, a corporation or an organization or a family in the country where I come from, the Netherlands, the royal family have now commissioned a study to look into the historical roots of the family fortune to see is it okay that we have all this money? So this is one of the reasons why some of these big fortunes may be immoral in their entirety. The second reason is that, and this is a reason that will speak most to, I think, mainstream economists, is that extreme wealth concentration is wasteful. Why? Because of a property of money, which is called the declining marginal utility of money, which means if you have very little money, it can do a lot of good in your life. If you're poor and you get another £100, it can really make a difference. But if you are already affluent and you get another £100, well, it may be nice, but not really crucial. And at some point, additional further wealth increases cannot actually really contribute to your quality of life. We know about research that tries to estimate this when you look at averages for countries. There is some research that suggests this for individuals, but it depends on the metric that you're trying to then look at. Is it happiness that you're comparing, or is it quality of life, which is a different concept? I did a study with my colleagues from economic sociology in 2018, where we asked a sample, which is a representative of the Dutch population. We gave them cases, vignettes, and asked them, how would you judge this kind of standard of living of this family? So we described the kind of house they had, the car, the savings, how many holidays they had, where they went on holiday. So we described their material quality of life and then asked them, how would you judge the quality of life of this family? Are they poor? Are they doing okay? Are they well off? Are they affluent? Or are they in the category so nobody needs so much money? And we wanted, of course, to find out where people draw the line between very well off versus having too much. And now, not surprisingly, people do not all draw that line at the same spot, but we can estimate a mean, and we found for 2018 price levels that for a family of two in the Netherlands, this was judged to be at 2.2 million euros. I should say, we've had a lot of inflation since. Housing prices are rising, so you should take this with a grain of salt. But that means that there is a level at which people intuitively say, look, now you have everything you need. Of course, I know that in London, housing prices is a totally different game than, say, in Rotterdam. But at some point, there is just no further addition to your quality of life that can be made by further wealth gains. And this argument is actually the one that seems to motivate most billionaires or multimillionaires who become philanthropists. Because they know if they reallocate that money to whether it's schools in Africa or soup kitchens or something else, that they can really do a lot of good. That is called the utilitarian argument. So this is in the philosophical tradition called utilitarianism. So this is one reason. But it is not entirely clear whether we could call this a harm. It's more that if you shift the distribution of wealth, you create more welfare overall. And now we come to the ones that I think are the genuine harms, and that is ecology and democracy. And not surprisingly, these were also the examples that I started with. Extreme wealth can undermine democracy. When I was looking at this hypothesis, I looked at what the empirical research that political scientists have done, and I found several mechanisms that exist how wealth concentration can influence the democratic process, and then I looked especially at the principle of political equality, which means that we each have an equal opportunity to contribute to collective decision-making. Roughly, there are three types. First, donations. You can make direct donations, or you can, like in the case of Mamdani's opponents. I found an absolutely hilarious interview with Donald Trump when he was still a businessman, when he was asked by a journalist, but why do you donate to both the Republican and the Democratic Party? Why? This doesn't seem to make sense. And then he answered, look, I donate to both of them because then whoever is in power, I can call them up. And of course, this is Trump. He's just saying how he sees things. But the problem, of course, with direct donations is that often these things they're not documented. It's the same like we have, for example, in my country, a suspicion that one particular political party receives donations from Vladimir Putin, but there's no proof. There's like a smoking gun. Why not? Because typically, if you do those kind of things, you will make sure there is no proof. So this is one problem, direct donations. And then there's what political scientists have done. They've been studying whether the policy decisions actually correspond more with the preferences of the richer people, and that happens to be the case. Both the richer people and in some countries also the more educated people. So it's not only wealth that is the only influence. The second mechanism is lobbying. Well, it's pretty clear. If you have a lot of money, you can just hire a lobbyist and they will try to influence members of parliament and the politicians to make laws that better represent your interest. I have case studies. It's not just a US thing. There's fantastic case study material. Well, fantastic, not in a democratic sense, but in a sense of proving this point from my own country. And I'm sure you have examples from your country too. And then the third mechanism is influencing the public sphere. And here I think it's very important to understand that democracy is not just voting. It's not just, okay, we all vote and then we add up the votes. Democracy is an ecosystem of all sorts of institutions that protect the balance of power. So, for example, judges are part of the democratic institutions. Universities are part of it, because you need institutions where the members speak truth to power. And very importantly, the media are part of democracy. So strong, independent media are really crucial for a healthy democracy. If you then have a situation whereby somebody of the type like Rupert Murdoch really becomes very influential in the media landscape, then this distorts democracy. In the Netherlands, we had elections last week, and I've been watching all the debates, and I could just see certain things happening in the media that I hope my scholars in communication department will really study in detail. And you could just see the framing and the kind of topics that were addressed benefiting certain parties. You could see also things that are amplified. There was AI material that was very harmful for in this case, the leader of the Labour Party, the Dutch Green/Labour Party. They produced some, actually it were members of parliament of our right-wing party produced material where he was seen as being in handcuffs. And this was spread over all of the social media, and it had just no repercussions. The only thing was that the leader apologized, and this was it. But if then that message has been going around 600,000 times, the harm has been done. So I do think we have a real big problem with social media and what social media do to our democracies, but also, of course, also still the traditional media. And there you just see, I mean, again, Musk is a good example, how Twitter changed from when it was still Twitter to after Musk bought it for 44 billion and then changed it into X, has been a good case study of how the influence of somebody like him can change a social media platform. These are the three mechanisms I discuss in the book. I think increasingly there is one that I only touch upon in the book, but that we increasingly should also discuss, which is the alliance between billionaires or centimillionaires and autocrats. So I think you all remember when Donald Trump was again inaugurated for his second term. There was this whole row of billionaires sitting behind him. And of course, they were major donors. Musk, who was not elected, just became chief of a previously non-existing department that, yeah, well, depending on how you judge these things, but I would say did a lot of harm to American society. So, and there is an interesting book written by Anne Applebaum called Autocracy, Inc., where she analyzes how these autocracies, and that can be really put in Russia or leaders in Venezuela or African countries or China, how they really not only form a network, but also how really their political models are there to enrich themselves. So this has become a business model for them. And there is this kind of cycle whereby wealth makes it possible for them to get elected, and then they use that political power in that international network to extract more money from their countries. And I think this is very, very dangerous because we know that this, well, it is ending badly for people who already live in those countries, but it could also spread further to other countries. So that is the political argument for libertarianism. Now, the ecological argument, I already mentioned the latest study that came out from the Paris World Inequality Lab. I'll just give you one more statistic just to make clear how the problem of wealth is related with the problem of climate change, and climate change is then actually one aspect of ecological concerns because biodiversity loss is also very important, but they're less, the indicators are less quantifiable, but because in the case of emissions, we can just calculate everything as CO2 or CO2 equivalent. We know that we need to go to net zero, try to get the emissions to zero or as close as possible. Right now, or at least a study published by Lucas Chancel in Nature 3 years ago, the world average was 6 tons. In Europe, we may be around 10, 12 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per person per year. 6 tons for the world, Europe roughly around 10, US 20. Africa, the average is 1 ton. Who will have the most damage of climate change? It is not the middle classes and the rich, it is actually the poor who cannot defend themselves. The 1% richest persons in the world have on average 101 ton emissions, and there's been a study that looked particularly at 20 billionaires, and then the emissions, and this is only from consumption, go up to 8,000 tons, depending on whether they have, how many houses they have, private jets and yachts. So that's clearly that these lifestyles are not sustainable in an ecological sense, yet the number of millionaires and centimillionaires and billionaires goes up year after year. So these are problems, I think, harms of wealth concentration that we have lost out of sight when we have seen wealth as an indicator of economic success. Now, I will very briefly tell you something about the fifth reason, which is the most, I think, fundamental but also unsettling, which is that if we talk about moral desert, which means when do we deserve something? So suppose you work 40 hours a week and you get a certain salary, and then you decide for whatever reason that you are going to reduce your hours to 20 hours, and you get half of the salary. I think most of us would say that this is reasonable, right? Because the amount of hours you put in is a ground for desert. And so there are certain inequalities that can be justified based on desert. They can be based on the effort you put in or the risks you take or whether your job or your work is dangerous. The miners were actually relatively well paid, but we know that they all ended up with major problems in their lungs. So there are reasons why certain inequalities can be deserved. However, there's no way we can justify the inequalities that we now see. Why not? Because what we need to realize is that of these really big fortunes, there's actually two sources. One is entrepreneurship. Actually Musk not only has his money from entrepreneurship, but people who build an enterprise. And the other one is inheritances. And about half of the big fortunes come from inheritance. Now, you cannot say that you deserved an inheritance, because in order to say that you deserve it in a moral sense, there must be something in your agency that justifies why you got that good, in this case, an inheritance. But why do we get an inheritance? Because we happen to be born with certain people, our parents. We didn't choose our parents. So that means it's a matter of pure luck. So I know that inheritance is a sensitive topic everywhere, but from the point of view of those who receive it, inheritance is purely a matter of luck, and we cannot say that we morally deserve it. We can say that we are legally entitled, but that's another claim. So that's one important form of luck. But then the other important source of our how we're doing in life is our talents. And a big part of our talents are inborn. They're genetic lottery, another form of luck. Another important part of how we're doing in life is the first 1,000 days in our life. Child psychologists and child development scholars have found out that the first 1,000 days in our lives are the most important in determining how well we will be doing in life. But the first 1,000 days, we are babies, we're toddlers. We cannot say that we then have control over what happens. Again, luck. Our social class, you get born into it, luck. So that means that the view of human nature that I think modernity, and I think also capitalism as part of modernity, has given us, namely that everything we get is due to our own credit, is vastly exaggerated because so much is due to luck. Not everything, but I think we really need to rebalance this. And I think some inequalities can be justified on moral grounds because of desert, but not the ones we're currently seeing. So these are all these reasons. I'll skip the last one because otherwise I can't get to talking about capitalism. There's some evidence that actually it's not good for the super rich themselves, but I'll leave that for another time. So these are all the reasons why I think inequality in wealth, which is the bigger inequality compared with income, should be limited, not just by making sure everybody has some wealth, but also by restricting it from the top. Now, this is what people say then. Oh, you're a communist. Am I a communist? No, I'm not a communist. I'm also not, I'm just happen to, this is a silly critique. And I'll try to explain to you why. And I should also say, Donald Trump said of Zoran Mamdani that he was a 100% communist lunatic. So, because he wants free childcare and free buses and the other rent freezing. This is actually a really, really bad critique. Why? It's what philosophers call a category mistake. When people say that limitarianism is communism, what they're actually referring to is not some exegesis of Marxian thought or some anarchist communist or whatever. They just mean the USSR or some other country in the Eastern Bloc or perhaps Cuba, where there was collective ownerships of the means of production, so companies were in the hand of the state, and the state had a plan, a half-year plan or a 2-year plan or a 5-year plan, and the state was deciding what would be produced, by whom, when, and where. This is, as you can see, what I've been arguing is for something to do with the distribution of wealth. Communism, as people who make this criticism argue, is a socio-economic system. So I think this is really a debate stopper. And so most of the time when journalists ask me, but what do you think about this critique that it's communism, I just tell them, look, this is silly, I explain them why, and we move on. But there is, I think, a question that is not a silly question, which is what, for example, this London-based multimillionaire who read my book, first being suspicious and then saying, yes, you convinced me, but I'm a bit unsure about whether this is compatible with capitalism. And this is a question that I should say I wasn't sure myself when I was writing this. Is this still compatible with capitalism? And I want in the remaining 8 minutes try to answer this question with you. Now, I think the problem is that if you go and look at the academic literature on capitalism, it's totally bewildering. There's so many different definitions, there's so many different understandings, and what I found reading in this and reading really in many different disciplines is that there is a big division between the people who work theoretically and the people who do empirical work. And unfortunately, I'm in the camp who do the theoretical work, and I have to say they're doing not a very good job. Here's an example. This is 2 philosophers who've written a book on the ethics of capitalism. They say capitalist society will have strong legal protections for private property. Yes, that seems right. Wide dispersion of private property across their population. I don't know why this would be an essential element of capitalism. Also, wide dispersion is it's a normative claim. And what does that mean, wide dispersion? I'll give you the data from the last Global Wealth Report. In Europe, 50%, so that's half of the citizens, have 1.6% of wealth. The top 10% has 66.7%. Do we call that wide dispersion? I don't think this is wide dispersion. So I think, and also if you put that in the definition, you're actually already kind of closing the debate whether actually capitalism is leading to too much of a dispersion of private property. Extensive international trade, yes, I mean, that's the way capitalism has evolved, and also historically. And actually, we're here in a room of somebody who was also engaged in this. So I don't think that is implausible, but I don't know whether it's actually, I mean, Trump is putting all sorts of barriers on international trade. It's probably going to harm the US, but I don't think then the system ceases to be capitalist. Consumer sovereignty is a concept from economics, which is that people decide themselves what they are the bosses over their own decisions, and including competition in the provision of goods and services. I'll give you a proposal for how to change this in a second. And then there is this diversity of employment contracts. I don't know exactly why this should be an element, but I do think what many scholars argue is, those who work in the political economy tradition, is that you have the big difference between those who own the means of production, which are then called the capitalists, and the workers, is that the workers can only gain their living, meet their needs by working. And this is important because that means that you have a possible power balance, because Adam Smith already in The Wealth of Nations pointed out that if you have workers who have nothing but their labor, and you have, in his case, that was the owner of the I think it was the pin workshop, that he can wait for a week if they negotiate the wages, but the workers can't because they need to feed their children. So that means that the pressure on workers and on the capitalists is different. And that, I think, is crucial to include. So I would like to propose as a working definition, yes, we keep the legal protection for private property, definitely extensive markets. This comes with competition, but not only competition. And I think what is really crucial is to put capital accumulation, which comes from profit seeking, but also from other sources, as the dominant driver of the socio-economic system. I've always kind of resisted this last thing, because to see a system as an agent, I, as an analytical philosopher who's also trained in economics, I found difficult. I think about people making decisions, not systems. But it is really, you have to then translate this to the people working in that system are seeking always to find opportunities to make profit. And the argument, the traditional theoretical arguments for capitalism was that competition drives down the price, actually eliminates almost the profits. The profits go close to zero, which maximizes what economists call consumer surplus, so the welfare for the consumers. But this assumes that markets are competitive. And here is the problem. Because what we've seen is that capitalism has evolved over the last 50, 60 years, and now is increasingly called what, for example, somebody like Brad Christopher called rentier capitalism, where rents are dominant. Rents is the payment to a monopoly asset, to a monopoly control of an asset. So basically, if you have land or housing or digital platforms or anything else where you control it, and think of Musk and Bezos and all the others, then you are able to have profits that are, because you have a monopoly, that are much higher than you would have in a situation of genuine competition. There's another definition of rents, which is basically excess profits, abnormal profits that are collected by capitalists because they have a certain monopoly or oligopoly on the market. And the problem with if a capitalism or markets are rent-driven is that it slows down innovation. Because if you have competitive markets, the different entrepreneurs that need to compete with each other are constantly looking for innovation to make a better product or a better service in order to sell their things. But if you have a monopoly, you don't need to do that. So that means that the traditional justification for capitalism based on competition was theoretically sound and could apply at the time when this was really the case, but that increasingly the system has changed into a form of capitalism that is, I think, creating many more problems for citizens. And here the empirical literature is really important, because when you read historians, economists, sociologists, and so on, who really look at the details, the empirical details of our current capitalist system, they will point out all the problems there are with the system. And they also point out that the profit motive was very important, say, in the period from 45 to 75, which are called les 30 glorieuses, when there was high growth, high welfare increase, high multiplication of our standards of living, but that is not the capitalism we have today. Is libertarianism then compatible with capitalism? I think it's not compatible with our current form of capitalism, because this form of capitalism really drives wealth accumulation into a small group of hands, as the data show. So the question then is, if you start from this minimal definition of capitalism, what would need to change for it to meet the values that are underlying libertarianism and all the arguments I've given? Well, we would have to add measures that limit wealth inequality. For example, change the tax system. I don't know whether you are aware that in the UK there was actually decades when the highest income tax bracket was in the upper 90s, and actually the same in the US. We had totally different tax systems in the 60s and the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So, limit wealth inequality, protect ecosystems, and reorient the socio-economic system to stay within the planetary boundaries. We need to create strong democracies, protect them from the influence of basically anybody, but in this case, people who have a lot of wealth, and then also make sure that we are able to meet everybody's needs. I think in an ideal theoretical scenario, this would give us something like a more egalitarian and green version of the mixed economy or social democracy that we had from 45 to 75. It does not require us to abolish markets. It does not require us to abolish private property, but it does require the restricting of the profit motive and also really to shift the power between capital and labor. Now, whether this is possible, I am not sure. There are scholars who say that this ideal is not possible because actually social democracy was only possible because at the time the capitalist countries actually were willing to make those concessions because of the threat of the USSR. I have no views on this, I don't know. But it is really a question that we should ask. So I'll come to my last and concluding slide. If everything I've said is correct, then what is really going on here? Why do people ask me whether libertarianism is a form of communism, given that I think it's such a silly comment? Well, I think it shows three things. First, that our societal discourse is prone to dichotomous thinking. We think in capitalism and communism, and this is really very unfortunate because actually we have a variety of capitalisms and we also have different systems. So you have capitalism which focuses on the market, you have the USSR-style communism which focuses on state ownership, but you have other systems including the commons, which is when citizens do something together, and for example, which you now see in energy cooperatives. And you also have, of course, the gift economy, which is, for example, where the philanthropists are engaged. So I think we have different mechanisms of provision, and we need to find out what the right balance is between those different mechanisms for different sectors. I think the second thing that the discussion shows is that many citizens believe that in the real existing communism, there were very low standards of living and there was dictatorship, and actually, I think they're right. But what they do not question is whether actually what we have right now is so good. And that is because many of the things that the empirical scholars show, like the control of the tech billionaires over our social media and what this does with our societies, with our democracies, as just one example, we are not always all aware of these things. So we may actually not be sufficiently critical towards the system that we have. And then finally, and this is my concluding comment, I do think we lack political imagination about possible visions for future socioeconomic systems. I think we should really go beyond this dichotomy of capitalism and communism and think about many different models. And this picture here is taken from the website of my research group, which is called Visions for the Future, where we're trying to really analyze all these different alternatives and look in detail what they would bring us in terms of the values and the principles that they would bring for citizens. So I hope to be able to report back on this in a couple of years. Thank you.